Hey guys, this is Denny.
And this is James from TeaDB. We are, as you can tell, bringing you a very special episode. So what are we going to talk about today, Denny?
So we're doing TeaDB basics. So we're going to talk about just basic essential tea knowledge, things that you guys should know about and need to know about in order to make what we think is a great cup of tea.
Yeah.
So, as you can tell, maybe it's talking about Gaiwans today.
It seems like it.
It seems like it.
Yeah.
So, critical part of brewing tea in the Gongfu style method is using a Gaiwan.
Yep.
And we're going to talk about how to use a Gaiwan. We're going to talk about different types of Gaiwans and then how it impacts the tea you brew.
Cool. Let's get going.
Yeah. So, if you guys have tuned into TeaDB already, you might know that this is traditionally how we do teas. So, we have a bunch of different offerings here, and I don't know, what do you want to start with?
Why don't we start with the rolled oolong from TeaDB?
Okay, cool. So they have a Dailing rolled oolong here. It's beautiful. We're going to pick some sort of Gaiwan. Do you have a preference?
Nope. Pick what you think would work best.
Okay, so I'm going to move this out of the way. This guy. I like this one because it's kind of colorful.
Yep.
And this was your first Gaiwan, right?
Yes, this was my first one, so it's got
Throwback.
a small chip as a result of
These things do happen.
misuse. So, Gaiwan, to talk a little about it, is like really one of the first things you should buy if you want to start practicing Gongfu style. Definitely would recommend starting with the Gaiwan over an Ishin clay teapot, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
It's a much cheaper way to go in general.
So I'm just going to do a quick rinse. Heat up the vessel, heat up the tea a little bit. So, we'll get some close-up footage. Lovely. But
So the one advantage a Gaiwan does have over an Ishin clay teapot is the aroma. It's known as kind of an aroma cup too. So smelling the lid, smelling the leaves, it's great with a Gaiwan.
yeah, so just so basically, the Gaiwan method that was just used is basically all that using a Gaiwan really is about. All you need to do is pour the hot liquid into the cup without the lid, cover it, and then create just a small seal. A small space around the seal of where the lid intersects with the cup, and then use that as a sort of strainer to prevent the tea leaves themselves from straining out into your serving device.
And ideally avoid burning your hands.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So, let's do that one more time. So again, we just have our open cup.
Yep.
Fill this up. And we'll let that sit for a little while. And yeah. So we'll talk a little bit more after this about some mistakes that are made commonly that we started doing, at least early on when we started brewing tea, and just some general tips.
Yep. And so Gaiwan in Chinese literally means lidded cup.
Mm-hmm.
So as you can see, these basically look like cups with lids.
Indeed. And I might have even used a little bit too much water in this one, so I might actually hurt myself a little bit here. But
and one thing you can do to fix that is to just sweep off the tops like that.
It's perfect. So, I'm going to say this has been about 30. So, there you have it. That's simple. All you need to do is pour liquid in, cover. You might want to brush the leaves out of the way a little bit, using a motion sort of like this. What that also does is it circulates the tea leaves themselves in the liquid in order to get maximum exposure of the leaf to the water.
Mm-hmm.
And then create a small seal, similar to this. You can see just a small little indentation here. And then pour. In terms of how you hold it, James, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so you can hold it a couple different ways. Some people like to hold it all the way at the bottom of the saucer. I personally don't like to do that, but usually I'll do kind of what Denny talked about, and then I will use my thumb on one side, my second finger on the lid and my middle finger on the other side. And it's important that you don't position it too close to where you're brewing. So if I were to do like this, for instance, and put my fingers closer to there, it's much more likely for my fingers to get burned. So I try to keep my fingers reasonably far back and then lift up, twist, and pour slowly. If you pour too fast, that's another way to burn your fingers because it will come out from a larger surface area, essentially.
True. And the other thing is if you pour too fast, the actual contents of the teacup itself might pop out, causing the lid to move in the wrong way. You're going to burn yourself, things like that.
Yep. And rolled oolongs are a great thing to brew in a Gaiwan. Smaller leaves like green tea and stuff like that especially can kind of escape through, and you'll get a little bit of sediment in your tea, but no big deal.
Yep.
Gaiwans are great for those teas as well.
Let's just give this a drink while we're at it. So a couple common mistakes that people make that I definitely made was using too much water. A common remedy for that, like James showed on camera, is just simply to kind of scoop a little bit of the water out. You want to do that sooner rather than later because otherwise you're just losing valuable tea. So, 1 second.
High mountain tea.
It's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Other mistakes are keeping the actual lid too far back, and then the leaves are going to come out. It's going to pour too quickly, and it could even slide out of your fingers, like in this motion. That can be a very, very painful experience for sure.
Yeah.
A common thing that I would probably recommend people to do is just fill up a Gaiwan with cold water and learn how to do it that way.
Yeah, definitely. That's how I did it. Or start with brewing green teas or white tea, stuff that you don't need to get to boiling water.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's going to cover most of the actual use of a Gaiwan.
Yep. One other thing you can do is, and I've seen Showen over at Floating Leaves do this, you see how you have this third piece, the saucer, probably the most neglected piece of the Gaiwan. You can pour some water onto this guy, and that will kind of serve as like to keep the bottom of this warm. And it's just a real small thing you can do if you're into like really mastering the art of the Gaiwan, just to keep your Gaiwan a little bit more warm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. But it's not super complicated, guys. It's a very straightforward, guys and girls, ladies and gentlemen. It's not a super complicated tool at all. So don't make it more complicated than it needs to be.
Yep.
Go ahead and just practice. That's the best way you can learn how to do it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Burn your fingers a couple times, no big deal. For me, I know, especially when I'm using bigger Gaiwans, I have a tendency to burn myself because I have to you start to grip it lower down. So like I would grip it here normally, and I would start to grip it down there. So try your best to grip it kind of on these edges, these lidded edges, and that's the best way not to burn yourself.
Absolutely. Cool. Well, let's move on to different types of Gaiwans, different sizes, different materials, and how those are going to eventually impact your brewing.
Yep.
Cool. All right, guys, so we're going to talk about different types of Gaiwans. Specifically, we're going to talk about different shapes. So a Gaiwan is going to be a useful tool for you brewing tea no matter what, but the shape of the Gaiwan itself can have an influence. So shape and the size as well as the material.
Yep, and this is kind of an intermediate to advanced concept. So for most of you, really, this is kind of like a FYI rather than like you should do this.
Yeah, totally. Yum. Okay, so we have a whole diversity of Gaiwans here, ranging from small. We have a wide-mouthed Gaiwan. We have just a decorative Gaiwan. This is similar to this in the fact that it's just purely decorative, and that's really the only differentiating factor of it. We have glass. We have an enormous one, and we have. I actually don't remember what this is called. James, you want to refresh me?
Well, it's. I forget too. It's a Korean brewing device, and you can find stuff like this in Japanese too. Sometimes these come in clay, but usually it's in porcelain.
And it, in a lot of ways, functions almost identically to a Gaiwan.
Yeah, it's very similar. You can see it's very similar in kind of like this bowl, cupped bowl sort of shape.
Cool. So why don't, James, in terms of the shape of a Gaiwan, how is the shape of a Gaiwan going to influence what tea you're going to brew and how you're going to brew it?
Yeah, so So for teas like a rolled oolong, kind of the standard shape of a cupped Gaiwan is good. So you can see that most of these are pretty much the same shape,
Right.
with the exception of that guy over there.
Right.
And so this guy, and you can even go wider than this perhaps, would be better for twisted or rolled teas like this, just in the way that the leaves will expand more horizontally rather than vertically.
That's right. And the other benefit of that too is that there's just more flat two-dimensional surface area on the top of the Gaiwan, so that when you're using a big full leaf like a twisted oolong, you're going to get a lot of that kind of maximal coverage when you are in fact pouring the hot water over it.
And so would that Gaiwan be worse to use, for example, a rolled oolong like the Doggyling we're drinking right now?
I think that if you were to sort of go to extremes, it would be harder to use this Gaiwan for a green tea or a black tea. It's a wide mouth, so there's going to be more surface area for the actual lid to hit the edge of the cup, which will make it harder to strain out the fine leaves.
Yep, so you'll see here we got a black tea and we have some very fine leaves right there.
Right. So in that case, it might be a little cumbersome. Again, these things aren't going to influence the function that much of the Gaiwan. It will influence the taste a little bit, but again, these are minute and kind of advanced little details here.
Yep.
So whereas, for instance, a small Gaiwan that's pretty shallow, that's not shallow, that's pretty tall, is going to be probably preferable for something like a green tea, a black tea, or a white tea.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So in terms of materials, James, we have a lot of ceramic, and we also have some glass, and we'll probably reference the show in which we brought Crimson Lotus on, and they actually did a raw puer out of a
clay Gaiwan.
Yeah.
Or part clay.
Yeah, it was yixing, I believe.
Yeah, I don't know.
Actually, I'm not sure, but and then it was ceramic on the inside.
Yeah, that's right. So some of the materials, you can see that the standard is very clearly ceramic or porcelain. But you can also have Gaiwans in glass. And I will tell you guys the truth right now. I hate my glass Gaiwan. I never use this guy. I find that I burn myself way more often using this guy than I do everything else, simply because it's more slippery.
Yeah, totally. I have a big 250 milliliter glass Gaiwan that I have burnt myself with constantly. The reason I think is that the edges themselves, if they were actually glass, would basically be razor sharp. So it's hard to produce a really good seal because they're rounded. So what ends up happening is that when you're pouring, the Gaiwan lid rotates way too freely in here, and you end up either pouring your tea leaves out when you're pouring, which is no fun, or you end up burning yourself pretty severely. On the plus side, it does look pretty cool to see the leaves expand in the Gaiwan.
Absolutely. So maybe if you're brewing green or white teas, where if you scorch yourself a little bit, it really won't be all that bad.
Right.
But it does look cool, especially. But one of the advantages of a Gaiwan, and one thing we actually didn't mention, is when the tea's brewing, you just go like this, and you can take a quick look at the tea's color. And so you can effectively achieve the same functionality.
And the other cool thing about using ceramic or a ceramic-lined Gaiwan is that it's going to have that white background for you to actually really, really clearly see the liqueur of the tea itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
One reason why we would use a ceramic cup like this, for instance.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, here you go, sir.
And so the other type of Gaiwan, and this one, it uses clay essentially. So you could have clay and glazed on the inside, so porcelain on the inside, kind of like Crimson Lotus did. So what purpose does the clay serve there? Well, it doesn't impact the actual taste, but what it does is create thicker walls, and so as a result, it retains the heat much better. Mm-hmm. So usually porcelain is better for things like green and white teas than yixing because it doesn't cook the leaves and because it does not retain heat as well.
That's right.
But that will kind of achieve some sort of middle ground.
Yeah, that's right. Now, be careful if you end up buying a clay Gaiwan because it will get quite hot, including the top right here. So,
yeah. And you can actually buy a clay Gaiwan that's not glazed on the inside, in which case you would use it kind of like an yixing, where you dedicate it to one type of tea.
Mm-hmm. How about big versus small Gaiwans? Do you have any preferences there or anything to say about that?
Yeah, usually I'll use a Gaiwan in kind of like the 100 to 120 milliliter range. This guy's 120. This is probably my other most used Gaiwan at 100. But if I'm having a group of folks over and I'm brewing for maybe 4 people or so, I'll whip out the big Gaiwan, 250 milliliters, just because it's much quicker at rather than doing tons of little tiny infusions. And I will use my tiniest Gaiwan in circumstances where I'm brewing, I just want a tiny amount of tea, or if I'm brewing a really precious tea, for instance.
Exactly what I would have said. So, yeah, for me, I'll end up going smaller because of the value of the tea. Also forces me to be more attentive to the process because I'm brewing more often.
Yep.
And bigger often ends up being my daily drinkers that I have a friend over and I'm like, hey, let's have some Oriental Beauty, and I'll make a whole bunch.
Yep.
So one other little note to keep in mind is just that by virtue of the size of the vessel, the heat distribution will be a little different. So you are going to get a little bit of a hotter Gaiwan coming out of a large one versus a small one.
Yep.
So again, watch your fingers, but practice makes perfect, or perfect practice makes perfect. So.
Yep. And I would recommend against going any smaller than 60 milliliters, just because that's not enough room to let your leaves expand at a certain point.
That's tiny.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, well, so that being said, with all this stuff, why don't we move next on to how these different things impact tea brewing and which teas to use.
Alright guys, so we are going to talk a little bit about brewing and like how you eyeball how much leaves to put in a Gaiwan, because let's face it, it's really annoying to take out your scale every time you want to brew tea. And your friends will think you're a huge nerd and they won't ever talk to you. This hasn't happened to me. But someone told me that. A good friend of mine.
So, my actual recommendation is that if you're new to tea, it does make sense, especially when you're trying a diversity of teas, to weigh out the amount of tea you're using.
Yep.
So, for instance, you buy a whole bunch of Baozong because you love it and you think it's delicious and you want it to incorporate it into your daily ritual of some sort. A great thing to do is just to measure out that tea in a small vessel and then put it in your Gaiwan dry, and then remember where it goes up to the Gaiwan. Move it around a little bit, shake it up a little bit, put it back down. Do it a few times, and then you can use that measurement of where it stands inside of the Gaiwan as your sort of rule of thumb, excuse the expression, measurement for how to measure the right amount of tea.
Yeah.
So that's what I recommend. I think that there are a couple just general guidelines that I do like to go by. So depending on the depth and of shallowness of the vessel itself, for me, I usually tend to, with a rolled oolong, just simply cover the bottom. If it's very shallow, cover the bottom and a little bit more. If it's pretty wide, just cover the bottom. And that tends to expand wonderfully. It's basically all we did in here, more or less, and it fits beautifully. Now, that same strategy with a twisted oolong, James, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so it's very different because, as you can see, these leaves are very fluffy. Mm-hmm. So depending on which twisted type oolong you're brewing, I tend to use a little bit less leaves for a Baozong, for example, than a Wooey oolong like this one. But I tend to brew with a heavy hand, so I will go anywhere from half to 3/4 or even all the way full with my Wooey oolongs. And maybe, what would be a good point for Oriental Beauty? Maybe a third?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something like that. And I think that Oriental Beauty has a lot of tolerance to how you want to brew it too. So I think that one in particular you can play around with a lot. I think that when it comes to green teas and black teas and white teas, you want to err on the side of less tea than more tea. And something that can be deceptive is something like an enormous Gaiwan, like a 250 milliliter Gaiwan. You're tempted to fill it up with a third of black tea, and that will produce often a very bitter brew. Very, very bitter. It'll fill up the whole Gaiwan eventually with the wet leaf, and it will just be way too bitter. So what you can do instead is just simply use less. Again, do the sort of measure first and then eyeball later strategy. But kind of a good rule, I would say, is that with white teas, green teas, and black teas, also keep it kind of cover the bottom of the Gaiwan. See how it brews. If you think it's a little bit light, next time do just a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't need to make it into rocket science. It's not crazy. You'll be able to detect pretty quickly the strength of the brew, and if you feel like it's a tasty brew or not.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and all of these Gaiwans here are suitable for almost every type of tea. So, but for instance, James, what kind of teas wouldn't you brew a Gaiwan with?
I mean, you can brew anything in a Gaiwan. Literally, you could brew rooibos in a Gaiwan.
You could.
You would probably get a lot of sediment, but I tend to brew heavier teas in Yixing just because that's my personal preference.
Right.
But they absolutely could be brewed in a Gaiwan, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. But those would be the teas. So like my pu'ers, my raw pu'ers, my ripe pu'ers, my roasted oolongs would probably be the 3 teas that I would tend to veer a little bit towards the clay.
And I think that's kind of a common, inside of tea culture, kind of a common practice too. So it's a good standard that you're going to want to use clay for hotter teas that can be tolerant of those really high heat, really hot water, and that's going to be, again, your sort of the whole breadth of pu'er, and then some of your heavily oxidized oolong teas.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Cool. All right. So let's wrap this up with where people can grab their first Gaiwan.
Yep. So I would definitely recommend checking out Yunnan Sourcing for their Gaiwans. They have an American site as well. If you don't want to wait 2 months to get a Gaiwan, I wouldn't want to wait 2 months to get my first Gaiwan. But they have a huge selection on the Chinese site and a smaller selection on the U.S. site. But really, in my opinion, Gaiwans are worth not really spending too much money on because they don't really affect the flavor of the tea all that much. I'd recommend spending some of that money on your tea or your Yixing, for instance. And the difference between a $100 Gaiwan and a $10 Gaiwan really isn't that much.
Absolutely. I'd say also just to recommend that in part, at least for me, and I think maybe for James too, one of the best parts about tea and about becoming fluent with tea and learning about tea is going to tea shops and even purchasing from your local vendors. So I would, it's going to cost you a bit more money, but there's a story behind it.
Yep.
There's a place and there's a name. And then, that's something kind of nice about that, something a little bit sentimental. So.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with paying $12 for a Gaiwan from your local tea store as opposed to $6 from Yunnan Sourcing.
Totally, yeah. And, I think the one benefit about getting stuff from Yunnan Sourcing is just that, hey, it chips, no big deal.
Yep.
Right? No big deal at all.
And it probably will chip or break. I mean, it's very common for even tea experts to kill their Gaiwans. A Gaiwan has a limited lifestyle.
Yeah, absolutely. So, James, if people wanted to learn more about Gaiwans, about tea basics, what should they do?
So you should check us out at TeaDB. We have a lot of info, mainly about tea and not necessarily teaware. So please let us know how you guys like this episode, what topics you would like us to cover. I think we have some exciting stuff in store, but we'd really love to hear from you, particularly about what you'd like us to cover.
Absolutely. I think next time on Tea Basics, we're going to talk about the different varieties of green tea from all over the world. So stay tuned for that. Subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't already, and check us out on our website, tdb.org.
Yep, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks.